Hey, everybody, you're about to listen to a interview that we did with Eric Teetsel. Eric is a great guy. We just got done interviewing him and had a pretty good conversation, don't you think, Riley?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, it was great to hear from somebody who's like on the inside on a lot of these things. We've talked about politics, like just you and I, and with some of the other pastors and staff here. But it's great
It was
to
nice
hear
to talk to someone that knew what they were talking about.
They knew what they were talking about. Exactly. Has some and not just a little bit of experience, but he's got like a lot of experience in the political realm. So yeah. And thinking about it with a Christian worldview, it's really helpful.
Yeah, Redeemer, when you listen to this, I just want you to know, the goal behind this is, I think both Riley and I would say that we are trying to continue growing in our understanding of what it looks like to apply a biblical worldview to all of life. Okay?
Yeah,
We're trying to continue to grow in that. And so part of our heart as pastors would be to help you grow in that as well. And so it's okay if you don't agree with every aspect of this that we're kind of pushing on and thinking through. There's some fluidity to how we're thinking through some of this stuff, meaning we're trying to push and to grow and to learn. And a little bit we're doing that publicly with letting you guys kind of see us process this with various believers. And sometimes we've read something, talked with one another, examined scripture and been like, man, this is what we think it looks like to be more consistent as Christians in every sphere of life. And so we thought, we've talked about this, as you said, Riley, we've talked about this with one another, but we really wanted to talk with somebody who sort of lives and breathes it, but who is a Christian, who loves Jesus, and that is still central to all of their thinking and has informed the way that they're thinking about this, and someone that we could commend to you in terms of they're faithful, and I think how they're thinking through these things are faithful. And so we wanted to learn from Eric, but we also wanted to, we want to, I should say, just continue pushing into this as a church, asking hard questions, dialoguing about this, and hopefully you'll find it helpful. We found it helpful. It was encouraging to us. And, I guess the one thing I would say is I do want you to know, Redeemer, we've obviously talked about politics a decent amount in a relatively short period of time. That's not all we intend on ever talking about anymore. This isn't like turning into a political a podcast or something like that. But maybe one of the reasons you're hearing more about it is, probably because of the political season, but also because it feels like an area that's neglected. And so when you encounter an area that is neglected and is sort of deficient.
It's a felt need for us,
when you see an area where you're like, man, we're really atrophied in that area. We need some bolstering, some strengthening, some helpful guardrails in terms of thinking. And it needs to be an area that we're comfortable talking about as a church. It's okay if we don't all agree with one another on every aspect of this, but we do want to engage this conversation and do so meaningfully. So that's sort of the intro to what you're about to hear, this interview. We pray that it would be helpful and encouraging to you as it was to us. Hey, welcome to Church Matters, a podcast designed to help the church understand and apply a biblical worldview to all of life. Gabe here with Riley, Pastor Riley, and we're joined today by a guest, a special guest. I'm thrilled to be joined by Eric Teetsel. And Eric, thanks for being with us, man.
Well, thanks, Gabe, and thank you, Riley.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being.
Yeah, Eric is a seasoned Christian political operative with a deep understanding of the intersection between faith and public life. Over the years, Eric has served in a variety of influential roles, including as the director of faith outreach for Senator Marco Rubio's presidential campaign, and as the executive director of the Manhattan Declaration, a movement that was focused on pro-life, marriage, and religious liberty issues. Currently, Eric serves as the executive VP of the Center of Renewing America, and he co-hosts a podcast that maybe you've heard us talk about. It's been in the Redeemer Weekly, and I think Pastor Jared has referenced it on Facebook, and I've referenced it. It's called the Bully Pulpit, and it's an awesome podcast. Highly recommend it. And he, along with others there, continues to champion the integration of biblical principles into the public square. And I'd just say beyond his professional accomplishments, Eric is a thoughtful writer. He's a passionate advocate for the gospel's relevance to every area of life and a voice calling Christians to engage culture with both conviction and grace. And so again, Eric, thanks for taking the time to join us today. I can't wait to dive into these topics with you, man.
No, I was all very kind. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, basically, Redeemer, that our goal in this podcast has been to help you truly understand and apply a biblical worldview to all of life, and that includes the political sphere. And so, Eric, I'd love first, just by way of helping people, I know I gave you kind of like, here's a little bio snippet, but just by way of helping people get to know you a little bit, maybe give us a snapshot of your background, some of your current work, kind of what drew you into this intersection of faith and politics. I'd love to hear about that.
Sure. I'll try to keep it brief. So I was born.
That's a good place to start. Yeah.
And born into a faithful family. My mom and dad loved Jesus. At like 5 years old, I got down off the couch after watching a TV ministry of a megachurch in Tulsa, Oklahoma, called Sheriff Bill and the Dry Gulch, I think it was called.
Okay.
And they did an invitation at the end of this episode, and I accepted it. And Jesus has been Lord of my life ever since. It stuck, it counted. And I've tried to walk with him along the way. I always loved politics. Again, dorky little kid. I used to ask my mom why my dad didn't run for president. And when she told me that wasn't something he wanted to do, I affirmed, well, then I guess I'll have to do it. In high school, voted best Republican for my portrayal of North Carolina Senator Jesse Helms at the Model Senate program.
Nice.
I mean, really geeking out.
Yeah, best Republican. They don't have that award that they give out in Washington schools, I don't think. Yeah, that's not,
times have changed. So anyway, I actually got away from policy and politics in college and wanted to be dean of students at a small Christian college someday. I went to Wheaton College and had a great experience there, but kind of moved away from the politics thing. And it wasn't until I was in my first full-time job at Colorado Christian University, where at the age of 23, I was a life direction advisor, doling out all my years of wisdom to the seniors in college who are several months younger than me on what they should do with their lives.
Right.
But I my boss's boss's boss was a former U.S. Senator named Bill Armstrong, who was the president of CCU at the time. And he brought with him an agenda to teach the faculty, staff, and students about several critical objectives. And among them were the things you might expect: become a great university, teach students to love the Lord with all their heart, soul, and mind. But because of his particular background, also things like teach the significance of an originalist understanding of the Constitution, or the power of free markets to raise people out of poverty, the contributions of Western civilization to human flourishing. And it really reawakened my love for policy and politics. And through a series of providential circumstances, I ended up getting my first job in D.C. at a think tank called the American Enterprise Institute. And I was just kind of off and running from there, over and over again, being endowed with awesome opportunities and responsibilities, none of which I earned or deserved, but just in the goodness of God and my feeble attempts to honor him in my work, kept moving along.
That's awesome. And so what, as you began sort of entering into that political realm as a Christian, did you come kind of preloaded with, this is sort of a dirty game, Christians really shouldn't be involved in politics, and had to be sort of retrained in that? Or did you this always seemed open to you and never seemed inconsistent with the Christian worldview? How did that sort of work for you?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're referring to. There is this general sense that politics is kind of like it's like a civic colonoscopy, right?
Yeah.
Every 4 years, you got to go to the voting booth and just kind of grin and bear it and then not think about it again. But I was really blessed not to have that understanding. And I think to be surrounded probably by some teachers and maybe growing up in a military community where there's sort of an ethos of public service, obviously closely connected to the government, where I was trained to intuitively understand this as a valid manifestation of vocation for a believer, and in fact, a good one. And then as I became a little smarter and maybe a little bit more theologically astute, eventually building a theology of government that recognizes that there are these pre-fall institutions that God created early on, Genesis 1 and 2 stuff, marriage and the family being one, obviously the church being one, but the third is government. You know, the reality is that even if Adam and Eve had never fallen, we would still have government. And someday, when the new kingdom and the new earth are established, we'll have government because it's needed. It's part of what it means for human beings to live amidst one another. That's all government is, right? Is just the organizing of human relations. And so I have never personally really wrestled with the idea that I, as a follower of Jesus, can and should work in this sphere if it's what I'm called to do. But I have certainly confronted that lie a lot.
Yeah. Did you in the churches that you grew up in, were they highly political environments in terms, I've grown up in churches. I've been involved in church my whole life. And so there's been churches I've been a part of where it was not uncommon at all to have a special 4th of July Sunday, where it's very, you might not sort of do the Pledge of Allegiance, but it was borderline. You have the American flag and the Christian flag, and everything's very, very politically charged. It's not unusual to have a political candidate come in or to just specifically endorse a candidate from the pulpit, that kind of thing. Were the church environments you grew up in like that, or is that like a I say that because, our church, and maybe particularly in the Northwest, I think there's a lot of people that anytime Christians start talking about politics, that's sort of the picture that emerges in their mind. They're like, "Oh, great, our church is talking about politics. Is this the vision? Is this where we're headed?" They think of the mega SBC churches that maybe sort of reflect that image sometimes in their mind. So yeah, I'm just curious, like, were the churches you were involved in like that, or when you think about the church being involved in the political realm, what do you think that vision should be for churches?
Yeah. I had a very diverse set of experiences. Again, as a military kid, we moved every 2 or 3 years. And when we were living overseas, we'd go to the chapels on military bases, which are distinctly Protestant, Catholic, and other.
Gotcha.
And so it certainly wasn't hostile to things like a 4th of July celebration, or in that context, especially like Veterans Day or Memorial Day, really recognizing the services. And then at other times, stateside, we'd go to a Southern Baptist church. I taught Sunday school at a Southern Baptist church in Kansas City. They always did an Independence Day service. They always did a Memorial Day and a Veterans Day recognition. But then there were other times where I would go to what I would describe as maybe younger, more sort of next generation churches, larger churches, where they were a little less inclined to do that. Again, never hostile and certainly nothing progressive, but where it was evident to me, for example, that the pastor might go out of his way to say something about George Floyd, but maybe not go out of his way to say something about Sanctity of Life Sunday. And that would catch me, someone who was highly attuned to this, to just say sort of like, okay, if there's a standard here, what is it exactly that would drive us to take that particular approach?
Yeah. Well, so knowing that, I think for our church, and a lot of, actually, I can't obviously speak for every Christian in the Northwest, but I think for a lot of people in the Northwest that are Christians, we have a lot of, we live in a very liberal environment. That's our context. And sort of the pressure that you feel generally as a Christian is sort of that sacred secular split, right? So keep your faith in the church, within your own mind, within your home. But as soon as you start trying to work that out into the public sphere, you're almost doing something that maybe you shouldn't be doing as a Christian. And so there's been a lot of conversation, particularly it seems like this last election cycle, but even since 2020, I would say especially, about things like, did America start as a Christian nation? When we talk about getting back to our roots, is that language? I was homeschool, public and private. I did all three. In the homeschool environment, learned about us being a Christian nation. Then public school, it was like, hey, all that stuff is garbage. You didn't really believe that. That's not really true. That's not our real history. And then, in a private school environment, it was kind of like, we're not sure. It's a mixed bag, and we don't know if we should think of it that way. So I'm just kind of curious, going back far, like if I was to start with a person and want to begin to build a political theology for them, I feel like part of what I would want to do is just to take them back to how should we think about even the founding of this nation that they're a part of. So I know this is a huge question and tomes have been written, but how would you answer the question, was our nation founded as a Christian nation? And to what degree should that matter today?
Yeah. If you don't mind going back to a little further, I think about the birth of Christianity in the few hundred years immediately following Jesus's death and resurrection and the establishment of the church and the early church and their mission. And what did we see? We saw eras of immense persecution, but ultimately the prevailing of God's church largely due to the love and sacrifice and service of individual Christians towards their neighbors, right? In spite of the way that they were treated, massive persecution, they just loved other people. They did things like take care of prisoners. They did things like rescue the babies that were left in the forest to die by people who didn't want them. And that spoke to the secular world around them. They were diamonds shining against this backdrop of black velvet. And at a time of immense darkness and pain and sadness and loneliness, the church had something to offer. And out of that, it exploded and eventually became dominant. It's not the only time it's happened. It's the same story with the Great Awakenings in the United States, both of which were precipitated by pain and darkness and suffering and the loss of faith, only for faith to burst back through because people were in desperate need of what only God can provide, living water and hope. And in both of those cases, in our context, spiritual revival precipitated political revolution, literally the revolution following the First Great Awakening. And then the Second Great Awakening leading directly into the temperance movement and the civil rights movement, the Civil War, and then obviously finding its culmination 100 years later. And that really gets for me at what political theology is.
That's good.
Is that the gospel has implications. It's not just something that we believe. It's something that we believe and then that changes the way that we live.
Yes.
And that then affects other people's lives because of our witness. And so there is no sense in which the gospel fully understood is not inherently political, because all that means is that you're changing your community and the world around you. And Gabe, nobody in your church would be surprised if you said the gospel has implications for your marriage, or the gospel has implications for your relationship to your kids, or even the gospel has implications for who you are at work and how you treat your colleagues. Well, just keep building out the concentric circles. The gospel has implications for every single aspect of your life. And it is only us, for whatever reason, who have decided to sort of carve out this exception and say, well, it's politics and we need to kind of be careful about that. It's just not so. But that does get to your second question about, are we a Christian
So that's
nation?
kind of like foundation for a political theology, right? I love that. That's where you're starting. You're starting with the gospel has political implications. We can't get away from that. I've heard it said, and I've said that, of course, Christ being king, that has political implications, right? That in of itself was a political statement. And so, yes, okay, so there's our kind of foundation for our political theology. And where would you take us next?
Right. Christ is king, but he's not king fully yet, right? We're in this now and not yet period of time where we know that he is creator, sustainer, and Lord of the universe, but he has also endowed earthly authorities with power now. Some of them are good, some of them are less good, but we're in this now and not yet period until he comes back and solves this thing once and for all. So then the question is, well, what for what? Are we just supposed to just, like make it through and then die and get to go to heaven, or get raptured and, off we go? Or is there a purpose? And I think clearly he has us on mission. We're here to do something, to use the gifts and talents that God has given us in service to the co-creation of his order and building his kingdom on earth as it is in heaven to the extent we can, which we recognize is not the full expression of what a heavenly kingdom will look like. And policy and politics is one of the ways that we do that. It's not the only way. There are lots of ways to do that, hundreds, thousands of ways to do that. But one of the ways is policy and politics. And here I would just ask listeners to consider for a moment the fact that all of the major cultural debates that are raging in America today are ultimately questions of Genesis 1 and 2.
Absolutely.
Think about that.
Yep.
Like it's like if you're Satan and his minions, you want to attack the root. And the root is, did God really say you were created male and female in his image? Did God really say that? Did he really say marriage is just between men and women for the purposes of building a family and filling the earth? Did he really say that we should go forth and multiply? Or maybe human beings are a scourge on the planet and we need to reduce our footprint? I mean, over and over and over again, the most progressive attacks are spiritual and theological attacks before they are political ones. I didn't make that choice. You didn't make that choice, but we as believers have a duty, if we take seriously our obligation to love others, to seek their welfare and the welfare of the cities in which we live, to borrow the phrases from Jeremiah, to the Hebrews living in exile. That's what we're here to do. And when the world says, did God really say, we say, that's
he
what
did.
Said.
Yeah, you're right.
Not for a theological fight, not to be right, though those are fine, but out of love. Because if you let someone be led down a lie, a path of deceit, it's going to result in pain and suffering. If you guide them towards what is true and beautiful and good, they will flourish as a result, whether or not they ultimately come to know the Lord.
Yeah, I mean, Romans 6:23, the wages of sin are death, right? And so
exactly.
The wages of sin are death. And so that means that things that don't accord with God's design for human flourishing and the building up of society are going to ultimately not just lead to a place of neutrality, but they're going to lead to destruction and death.
You don't have to believe in God to believe that he created the laws of physics and gravity, right? Well, if we as a society said, well, because those are theologically rooted, we need to reject any laws or regulations that touch on the laws of gravity, all of our stuff would fall down and we'd all die, and that would be bad. So it's the same thing when it comes to the other laws that govern society, whether they are relational laws or economic ones. If God did it, it's for our good, and we should follow it. And that raises the question of, are we a Christian nation? Because now we're sort of hitting on it. It's like, okay, but to what extent? And when people ask me this question, my first response is always, well, what do you mean exactly? Because if what you mean is we're a theocratic state where God is the head of the government and all government officials are merely instruments of God's will, the answer is no. That is not how America was founded. And some people do try to misportray or convince others that that's what people like me are seeking, and it isn't. What the founders understood was that there is this inherent political problem where laws do come from God, but also people who claim the mantle of God tend to sometimes do really evil things in the name of God, and that power corrupts. So how do you create a construct where you recognize that there is natural law, both moral law and physical law, and that you need to honor those things and create a government that is in accord with those things while also having a check on power? Because we've seen what happens when too much power under the authority of God is invested in individual people. And they constructed America, which is kind of the best of both worlds, where we talk about the laws of nature and nature's God, but we also talk about individual sovereignty and self-government and the need for a republican system that creates checks and balances and different levels of government so that no one person gets too much power. But the founders were very attuned to the laws of nature and nature's God. They understood human anthropology. They understood inherent sin extraordinarily well. And in fact, that's the foundation upon which they created the system under which we live. And furthermore, they were also almost universally believers of some form or fashion. There were state churches in almost all 13 colonies. It was only the federal level that they didn't want there to be a state church. There were all kinds of policies related to using tax money to subsidize the church. I mean, their relationship to religion was much, much looser and more comfortable than anything like what we have today.
Yeah, I think if I remember right, the State Church of Massachusetts wasn't abolished until like 1864 or something crazy like that. Like it was around for a long time.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when we think about, I think where this question comes up of, were we a Christian nation? It gets to this idea of intent. I think it's interesting. You talked about the Constitution and being taught originalism, right? In regards to the Constitution, and obviously that's a big debate that comes up among in the Supreme Court or among various justices. Is how much should they be that? Is that? And I mean, there's crossover with Scripture. How much should we be original? What was the authorial intent behind this particular book, right? Or do we have the freedom to sort of reinterpret it for our current day and age? And we're originalists when it comes to Scripture. What is God's intent? What's the author's intent? And I think we should be the same in regards to the Constitution. But where it comes up is people will say, well, because we were never founded as a Christian nation sometimes, then the idea of getting back to our Christian roots is really a misnomer. That's never who we've been as a people. And so they find it kind of odd that Christians are pushing in a direction to say we've lost something and we want to recover something, or we've something has gotten distorted and we want to correct that distortion. And so, but if we were never found as a Christian nation, I don't think that necessarily undoes the idea that, well, maybe we should be more so. But I think that is I think of it as a way of erasing some of our history, honestly, because I think we were founded at least with some sort of Christian principles that were guiding our country, and so it's not wrong to talk about a recovery effort. But would you agree with that? Or
totally, and more than just principles, but widely shared beliefs. And maybe the question is less like, what does it mean that we were Christian, and more, what does it mean that we were a nation?
Yeah.
And that's a point that people tend not to focus on. But a nation is not just lines on a map. It's not just colors on a globe. You're talking about people.
Values and principles.
Values. People in a place, from a place, with a shared background, with shared convictions and shared beliefs. This is what John Adams meant when he talked about how the Constitution was suited for a moral and religious people and wholly unsuited for any other. We're not dictating by law that you have to be a follower of Jesus Christ in order to be an American. But if this thing is going to work, we as a nation have to have this bedrock of shared values, beliefs, and principles in order for us to come together and progress. And in an era of multiculturalism, where we've been taught for decades the opposite of that our strength is our diversity. Well, no, not actually, which isn't to say anything negative about diversity per se, rightly understood, but there is no such thing as a nation that doesn't share something. And the less that you share, the more divided you're going to be from one another. And I think we're living through that, right? Have people in America ever felt more isolated and divided from one another than they do today?
People, I think, get hung up sometimes when they think about that because they've been taught to think of diversity as primarily thinking about ethnicity. And so when we talk about there's strength in our diversity or something, some people think, oh, that's really only applying to various ethnicities, and we'd say like, yeah, that's awesome. Like, okay, we love having various ethnic backgrounds and makeup in our country. That's great. But then when you start talking about a value system and you start talking about the culture that comes with various people, it's like, okay, so what's the culture that we're trying to develop as a country? Do we still care about freedom of speech? Do we care about, for example, do we care about religious freedom? Are these values that we all still are kind of bought in together? Too. Otherwise, we're going to have a really tough time being a cohesive nation if you really are at the point where you're debating which cultural values are going to win out. Then that's not really our strength. At that point, we have a lot of division, right?
Yeah, precisely. Yeah.
So where would you take us next in terms of a Christian forming a a political theology. So it goes back to Scripture, and then we have, particularized to our nation. We have to start thinking about what was intention and what were those values and guiding worldview that essentially built our country. And where would you take, maybe even to the individual Christian today? Where would you go?
Yeah. Lots of thoughts. One of the, I'll just start here and we can riff for a while, but one of the paradigms that I have been thinking about for several years is that of exile. And I mentioned Jeremiah earlier, but I am increasingly persuaded that the exilic literature, books like Daniel, letters of Jeremiah, Nehemiah, Esther.
I just taught through First Peter for like almost a year, which is really just borrowing those exile themes, right? I mean, that's what Peter starts
literally
off from
calling
those books.
Rome Babylon, right? And I think he refers to the Christians living all over that area as exiles. Yeah, I mean. So there's this beautiful roadmap that God has given us to say, hey, they were not living in their home for an extended period of time, and here's how I instructed them to do that. And you guys are not living in your forever home, to which I will eventually call you back either. America, the earth, is not not my forever home. I am an exile here. But that doesn't mean that I don't have duties and responsibilities and opportunities here. And all you have to do is look at these folks and how they lived to see countless examples of that. And some of them are teachings about what the world is going to want to do to you to conform you to their purposes, right? And you can look at Daniel and his friends under the tutelage of the chief eunuch, and they're changing their names, and they're changing their diet, and they're changing the stories that they tell around the campfire at night, all to indoctrinate and propagandize them into being Babylonian and not Jewish. Yes. The names themselves, you guys will know more about this than me, but they literally take these Hebrew names that were references to Jehovah, and they flip them so that they're now references to Baal. Literally.
Balthazar. Yeah.
Exactly. And then you can talk about accommodation, and Daniel and his friends say, hey, we understand we're not the dominant culture here, but there's some things that we can't do based on our convictions. Can we figure out a way to make this work? And in fact, they are able to in those circumstances, and it works out. And I think there's a lesson for the church there in certain circumstances, certainly for believers who are living in places like China or India and many other nations around the world where Christianity is not the dominant culture and is in fact persecuted and beleaguered. A little different for us in this state and what we should be thinking about and advocating for. But that's just a couple of examples. Another principle I think that's really important is the idea of triage. So when an EMT arrives on the scene of an accident, they have to quickly assess the damage and say, okay, this person has a bruise on their foot and they're bleeding from their head. One of these matters more than the other one. And so we're going to address the bleeding head and leave the foot for later, because that could kill you. And this other thing isn't as serious. And when it comes to politics, I think that's a task that Christians have to do. It is true that the Bible speaks to everything, but it speaks to everything in varying degrees and with varying latitudes for individual believers to use their wisdom and discernment to try to act in a biblical way. So, what should the top marginal tax rate be is not an issue upon which the Bible is explicitly clear. Yeah. I don't know that you can point to a verse and say 10, 15%. But that doesn't mean that there isn't wisdom within Scripture that could help us to sort of try to make some judgments and then proceed accordingly. Compare that to what should marriage law be, and here we see that, okay, the Bible is pretty frank about what marriage is and why it is that way. And so we as believers are obligated to stand on what we know to be in a much clearer way when the Bible speaks with such clarity about those things
Have
and
you
to
heard,
prioritize accordingly.
Have you read or are you familiar with Andy Naselli's political article he wrote on like jagged line and straight line issues? Have you encountered that?
No, I haven't.
Man, I found that so helpful. He talked about jagged line issues, meaning tax rate, what's the best policy in terms of immigration, how do how do we fix that system, those kinds of things. Those are jagged line biblical issues that Christians, well-intentioned, could disagree with one another and have good debate about how do we love our neighbor. And then you have straight line biblical issues, and those are things that, man, when we talk about Genesis 1 and 2, we're talking about creational ordinances, the marriage and human dignity and these kinds of things. And it's like, man, you can draw really straight lines from Scripture to various policies and say a Christian ought not be in favor of that. And so when you have one party that is advocating for the abolition, essentially, of these straight line biblical issues, as you do in the Democratic Party, that becomes a lot harder for a Christian to say, I said something this political. I'm not a super political person. It sounds weird to say. I'm growing in that. I have not always been that, so I feel like I'm very much learning what it looks like to be a Christian, be a pastor, and speak faithfully to these things. Our church is being patient with me in that. But something I said this last political cycle was, I stand by it, as I think it's biblically indefensible at this point for a Christian to vote for the Democratic ticket, because I think the policies that they're putting forward are so antithetical to straight line biblical issues. So there's lots of issues in the Republican Party in terms of jagged line issues, but right now, and there's some ways I want them to mature and grow and reform some of those straight line biblical issues. But I think at this point they're more aligned with those straight line biblical, those straight line issues than the Democratic Party is. Would you critique that in any way? And maybe I'm preaching to the choir there a little bit, but I'm just curious what you think about that.
No, I think it's extraordinarily wise, and I love that you threw in the important point that the Republican Party is far from perfect. That is true, and you don't have to do anything other than work with the Republicans for the last several years, like I have, to see that. And I keep a special ire for my fellow Republicans because of the way that they so often operate. But the reality is, what you said is right, and that this hasn't always been the case. There was a time when I think a Christian could quite reasonably support a Democratic candidate for an office. But increasingly, I think that is hard to reconcile just because of what that entire movement really stands for and what they're trying to do. Again, that doesn't mean that the Republican Party is perfect. Far from it. And there are things that I would like to see done differently, but the Republican Party is not currently advocating for evil to be normalized. And that is something that the Democratic Party is doing. And I mean it at a party level. There may be individual Democratic candidates who don't support that stuff, and good for them, hard to do. But especially like in the midst of a presidential election where you're not just voting for an individual person, you're voting for a person with 2.5 million government employees who are going to do what they tell them to do across virtually every sphere of life. You have to ask yourself, can I reconcile that with these biblical admonitions that are straight line issues, like you said?
Do you? Why do you think it is? You've talked with a fair number of churches and pastors and Christians, and I don't know how often you've made it out to the Northwest, but what's your sense of why Christians are reticent to say something, even like what you said when you said these are evil policies? For example, I was having a conversation with the barista that gave me my coffee this morning, and she's a Christian, and we were talking, and politics came up because she asked me, what are you doing today? And I told her I was talking with you, and maybe she'll listen to this, but I told her I was talking with you, and she said something about politics, and she said, yeah, man, the one time I just got so turned off to the church was they called the Democratic Party evil, and I just couldn't believe that someone would talk about it. They're just different opinions. They're just different ideas. And but I mean, I told her, I said, well, honestly, increasingly, I've been convinced that you can and you ought to speak about it in those kinds of terms. And I know that's uncomfortable because we like everything kind of relativistic and let's coexist and everybody has their opinions. But you said evil, good. I don't know if you would make that contrast, but why do you think so many Christians are uncomfortable with that, and maybe why shouldn't they be?
Yeah, lots of reasons. One is that I think that some people who are politically aligned, maybe a little more like me, have wrongly baptized the Republican Party and used it and been used by it to accomplish their own secular purposes. And that's not okay. That's not right. It is not the case that everything that someone with an R before their name does is biblical and right and the right thing to do. And if anything, I am feeling so blessed that I am kind of in this world at a period where our conception of what conservatism means is changing and for the better, I think, in a very healthy, difficult, challenging process. And we're not entirely sure what it's going to shake out like, but you know, the party of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump does not look like the party of Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
And it's not going back. And I think we'll be better as a result of it. And it's lifting up some of those things that rightly deserve to be criticized. I think it particularly have the policies of this party been to the benefit of the vast majority of Americans, especially the least of those, or have they worked to the benefit of those who needed it the least, the wealthy, and the privileged and the powerful? Those are biblical questions too. And for me as a person of faith, it's the reason I'm wrestling with them. So I want to acknowledge up front, that important point. But I also think it's important for people to maybe begin to wrestle with a spiritual truth that I myself have not always wrestled with sufficiently. And that is the reality of the spiritual warfare that is happening around us. You know, I kind of was raised in this, like, you know, frozen chosen, my hands don't go much beyond here, kind of heady Christianity. And the reality is that Satan is prowling the face of the earth like a lion, looking for someone to devour. And the psalmist says in Psalm 2 that the nations are raging against the Lord. Over and over again in Daniel, the latter half of Daniel is basically like this wild story about angels wrestling with other angels from different nation states to which they're assigned. I mean, it's a whole thing that our church today really does not grapple with. But if you don't think that castrating 2-year-olds is a spiritual issue and that Satan is not involved in something like that, I would just say you're not familiar enough with the history of idol worship and false gods, where the least of these, and in particular vulnerable children, have always been the first to be sacrificed to false gods. And we're doing it again today, and we've been doing it for 100 years through abortion and now this insane trance phenomenon. So I don't use phrases like evil lightly. It is with a biblical first spiritual lens that I evaluate these things. And I'm not saying that everything the Democratic Party does is evil, but so many of the things that are predominant for them, upon which they stand, abortion being first and foremost, which is increasingly the end all be all for which the Democratic Party exists, is evil, and someday will be recognized as such universally. I think that leads to the second explanation, which is fear. I mean, look, we all have a desire, I think, to be thought of approvingly by those around us. That's natural. I want my neighbors to like me. I want to have friends. I want my family members not to hate me. But again, like, read the Gospels and show me where Jesus's promise is everyone's going to love you if you follow me. It is the opposite, y'all. And every single one of the apostles was martyred. And, you know, Jesus, who was literally love incarnate, embodied, who never sinned, was tortured and murdered. So if they did that to him, what do you think's going to happen to you if you express some parcel of what it is that you're supposed to do as a follower of him? And if everybody just thinks you're hunky-dory, I think it should be a signal to question whether or not you're really following the mandate to not be fearful and to be a witness.
That's good, man. I think one of the times that sort of a pillar fell in my thinking, that was where a wall fell that was in opposition to what you're saying there, was during COVID times, which were such a massive, monumental kind of shift for people, a lot of people in their thinking. But for me, one of the things that it affected was I'd been thinking so much of loving my neighbor meant, if I was honest, it was basically people pleasing. It was fear of man. So the missional idea of, if your church disappeared, would the neighborhood around it grieve? And that was very common thinking in terms of how I was taught to really think through missional ideas. Was okay. We ought to be. If our church disappeared, this neighborhood, this area should grieve. They should notice and want us here, and your neighbors should be sad that a Christian moved out of their neighborhood. I think there's been a lot of interesting work around, Aaron Wren has had interesting work around the whole negative world idea and that kind of, the shifts from neutral to negative world. And maybe some of that's part of what was mapping over this. But then COVID kind of created this moment where I went, okay, well, we're going to sing as a church, even though our governor has told us we're not allowed to sing. We're still going to sing. I don't know that our neighbors are going to love that. And yet I think we're being faithful to Jesus here. So, okay, what does that do to that category that I have there? Okay, we're going to go and pray outside of the Planned Parenthood clinic or the Cedar River clinic where they're doing abortions regularly, and where our governor is saying that they want us to be a sort of sanctuary state, if you will, to abortions, and wants to do all that they can to make sure that people can come and get free abortions in Washington State. Well, we're going to go stand outside of the Planned Parenthood, and we're going to seek to rescue babies and moms and dads from this murder. And I don't know that all my neighbors are going to love that. In fact, I know that several of them aren't. Well, we had a post that we had made related to pro-life kinds of issues that ended up on a Reddit sub-post and had 300 and something comments of people talking about all the horrible things they were going to do to us. I don't think they would grieve a whole lot if our church disappeared off the face of the map. In fact, I think they'd be quite happy. So it's that thinking of like, how is a Christian? So I think fear is a huge part of it, fear of man. And I think sometimes the church has done a disservice in the way they've talk to Christians, is the way that you're evaluating whether or not you're being faithful somehow is this weird inversion of that exact idea of what Jesus talks about, that he was hated, you should expect to be hated. And yet we've turned that into looking at Daniel and going, well, look at a blessing. The city actually, the region actually counted them a blessing. They were thankful that they were there. And so in the same way, we ought to be a blessing to the city, and they should be thankful that we're there. And I think that gets increasingly hard to argue for when you're actually trying to push into the culture in a way that reflects what God says allows for the flourishing of human society.
Yeah. Yeah, they were thankful that they were there when they weren't throwing them into lions' dens or fiery furnaces.
Yeah,
I mean,
right,
it's both.
Yes.
And I'm just struck by the power of leadership, good or bad, right? We can all think of examples maybe in our lives where you see very charismatic, terrible people develop a following because they're the only ones speaking. And it's just like, people are hungry, man. They are looking for something, and they'll find Andrew Tate, or they'll find Jordan Peterson, or they'll find fill in the blank Oprah. I don't know, whoever it might be. They're going to find somebody to follow because they're looking to follow. If we're not speaking.
Well, and even just Christless conservatism, right? So, Ben Shapiro or Rubin, or some of these guys that are political commentators who I agree with on a lot of various things politically, but they're not all Christians, and so I think that's even been a thing that's been interesting to me, is to see that when Christians aren't speaking into this, then what we don't want is the pendulum swing away from the goal as Christians isn't just to see the pendulum swing away from extreme liberal policies to now conservatism. That wouldn't be a win for us as Christians, right? The win would be that Jesus actually and biblical principles and values and what God says actually allows for human flourishing would be more and more reflective in the society that we live in, I think.
Yeah, that's right.
And if Christians aren't speaking into that, then who is, I guess. So that kind of brings me to an idea that I hear a lot about. It feels we did a podcast episode on it related to Christian nationalism. And, I feel like it became a little bit of a boogeyman phrase. I know some Christians have really distanced themselves from it. Others, like Kevin DeYoung, I think wrote helpfully on it to say, what are we talking about? What does it actually mean?
Yeah.
Different people mean different things by it. Stephen Wolfe means one thing. Doug Wilson might mean another thing. Al Mohler means a different thing. And yet they're all kind of called Christian nationalists.
Yeah.
I'm just curious for you. I feel like some of the things we're talking about would be called Christian nationalism. How should Christians even think about a phrase like that? Should we run from it? Should we embrace it and try to define it? What do you think?
Everything you just said is right, and it is critically important to define your terms and know what you're talking about. What you said about it becoming kind of a boogeyman is also 100% right, and not an accident. 2 years ago, not a single person on the left was using the term Christian nationalism.
No. Yeah.
How do you think an entire movement, including politicians, activists, and the corporate media apparatus, all start using the same language at the same time? I mean, it's not a coincidence, right? This is an organized, poll-driven, professional PR campaign and political campaign that is launched against a concept. That's how these things work. By people in Washington, D.C., derived by people in Washington, D.C., and New York City and L.A. And the right does it too, for what it's worth, though I think the left does it better. That being said, when someone asks me if I'm a Christian nationalist, I usually just say, well, what's the alternative? A Christian globalist?
Or non-Christian nationalists.
Or non-Christian nationalists. I mean, those seem to be like, if the four squares exist and it's Christian, non-Christian, nationalist, or globalist, I'll choose Christian nationalism of those options, because God made me an American in his sovereignty. This nation exists under his sovereignty and authority, and I was born under his sovereignty and authority. And therefore, I believe I have an obligation to care about this place. I am of it. My family is of it. My children are of it. I should seek its welfare. And as a believer, I'm doing it as a Christian, seeking the welfare of the nation under which I live in accordance with the principles and values of my faith is Christian nationalism, as I understand it to be. And I suppose you could get into the weeds in all kinds of ways, but that's the top line.
Do you think that Christians will embrace that language and define it and try to just kind of own it, or do you think that they've been that the left has done a good enough job of making it this pariah? Anyone who associates with that as a January 6th, wants to overthrow the government or whatever they have kind of tried to attach it to, and Christians will run from it. And should we run from it? Should we embrace? Like, what do you think about that aspect of it?
Yeah, good question. I don't know. I'd be a little surprised if the evangelical church writ large was just like, we're embracing Christian nationalism. That's probably not going to happen. But am I hopeful that they might embrace kind of the underlying truth of that what we're talking about is God's witness to the world and loving our neighbor? Yeah, I am hopeful about that. And I don't really care how it's branded. I don't think it's something that we should be afraid of per se. I remember I went to this church when I was very young, living in Denver. Denver is this hip city.
My brother's a pastor in Denver right now.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yes.
And I went to this, you talk about hip. This was like emergent church era. We were meeting in a college auditorium, and they hired a literal jazz quartet to do jazzed up renditions of 18th century hymns.
Sweet. Did you have a painter on the stage at all? Were they
exactly
during the service? Yeah, perfect.
Yeah, and this church should have been called like the Grove or Water's Edge or something. Yes. And I remember it was called City Presbyterian Church. And I remember going to our pastor one day and saying, given everything about this whole thing, how in the world are we called City Presbyterian Church?
That sounds a little stale for what we're doing. Yeah.
Yeah. And he said to me, everyone in our society is trying to sell everybody else something and package it and market it. And the people have been attuned to the fact that they're constantly being sold. And what I have found is that they really appreciate the authenticity of someone just saying, we're a church, we're a Presbyterian church, come if you want.
Yeah. Huh.
And I've always really appreciated that. And I think that's probably the attitude that we should embrace more.
That's good. Can I ask you some rapid fire questions here?
Hit me. Yeah, let's go.
All right. So here's some kind of lightning round questions. What do you think is the most misunderstood concept about Christianity and politics?
Oh man, I'm really thwarting the whole rapid
That's
fire of this.
Yeah.
We'll edit it together so it seems like it was perfect.
We'll make you sound even quicker. Don't worry. Yeah.
Most misunderstood Christianity and politics.
Yeah.
You know, I think it's probably ultimately that this is about power, and that what we want to do is use an idolistic power to enact something like Christian morality rather than relying on the power of the Holy Spirit to sort of change things. There are certainly people who might do that, but I think that if we understood it more as an institution created by God to do very specific things for a reason, and in so doing, make justice and thriving happen on the earth, that we'd be better off.
Okay. Should pastors endorse politicians? This is where Andrew Walker, the ethicist, would be great, right? We ask him all these ethical questions. I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this. I don't know if this is fair. So
I think that Andrew has helpfully. Don't tell him I said this because I don't want Andrew to.
He'll never hear this.
He helpfully lays out sort of a rubric for pastoral engagement, and he talks about competence being one, knowledge being one, and I think there's a third part of this, or maybe it's sort of like whether the Bible speaks with authority on these issues. And so I don't know that there's one specific rule of thumb that should always dominate, and you can get into a pattern where it's like, all right, if you're going to endorse a presidential candidate, okay, well, what about your mayoral race? What about the city council? What about the school board? What about the governor? What about senators? There's always an election happening somewhere.
Yeah.
And how and why would you do something in one situation and not another? So I think that pastors need to be prayerful, surround themselves with wise folks, use their best judgment and conscience, and try to make wise decisions about those things. I'm not sure I would say, yes, in all circumstances you need to do this, but there are probably some ways that churches can be a resource to the people in the pews so that they can also make wise decisions, whether that includes endorsing all these candidates from the pulpit or publishing some kind of a guide to make it easy, partnering with an organization like a state family policy council to distribute what they're doing. There are lots of ways to crack this nut. If an individual pastor themselves just you're trying to marry people and bury people and create a sermon and go to the hospital. You all have a hard job and it doesn't stop. So it's okay. I think it's okay not to expect pastors to be also the political guru for your entire congregation, but all the more reason to take advantage of some of the resources that do exist so that you're meeting that need.
Yeah, that's good. I tell people, like, as pastors, we got to be generalists, and so it's really tough for us to be. I don't want to. Sometimes somebody will ask me, "So, what do you think about the Ukraine-Russia situation? Do you think that we should Russia?" And I'm like, "Man, I'm not." I want to help you think well about this, but honestly, I'm kind of ignorant to all the ins and outs of it. You might know about it more than I do. Help me out, And what do you think? Should Israel keep going on? And I'm like, man, I'm working on my sermon right now. I'm trying to find out what the heck Jesus means when he says the Spirit goes where he goes. Like I'm trying to figure that out, and sometimes it can be tough to be an expert in everything. That being said, I think sometimes pastors use that as an excuse to not speak into the political sphere whatsoever, and I don't think that's a great approach to it either. Okay, next question. Do you think more Christians need to get involved in politics?
Yeah, I do. And what that looks like, I don't know. But when I was living in Kansas City, my church was a pretty big Southern Baptist church, 4,000 or 5,000 people. And there was a brand new city center that was built in our town that had an outdoor pavilion area for events, and it could be rented by groups for whatever. And dog meetups or farmers markets or I don't know, whatever. I don't know what a dog meetup is. I don't know.
So we have lots of those in the Northwest. Yeah.
Our church goes, and they were going to rent it to do like a sunrise service. And the town council said, no, we don't do it for churches, which is blatantly illegal and wrong. And our church chose not to make a fuss about it and make a to-do out of it. Just I had hoped that they might, but they didn't. But then election season came around, and I looked at the data, and you know what I found? You know how many total votes it would take to win a city council seat in that town? 900.
Wow.
900 votes for a city council seat, and we have 5,000 people in our church. So if our church just said, you know what, church members, we need the city council. Let's get out and vote. We're going to take this thing over. We're going to make good, wise choices, and we're going to get to use the pavilion. And by the way, we're going to let everybody else use it too. We could choose to do that. But there was no vision for that, no sense of like, oh, think about the good you could do. Think about the pornography you could keep out of schools and libraries if you did that. Think about the silly, stupid LGBTQ forcing bakers to make cake stuff that you could just nip in the bud just by doing this part-time job and members of your church. And oh, by the way, they could, if they liked it, grow and become state representatives, state senators and representatives and congressmen and president of the United States. I mean, you can, there's so much power to do good, to love others in doing that. There's just not a lack of vision for it. And I think that's too bad. So I'm not saying everybody needs to do what I do for a living, but I do think that every Christian needs to take more seriously their duty to steward their citizenship well.
That's good, man. I love that. Thanks for that practical example. I do think sometimes people are really averse to the power levers, if you will, in the political sphere, and they think that, well, that something about that feels like not our place or something, and yet we got to recognize that somebody's going to be pulling those levers, and do we want someone with a Christian worldview that is affecting those kinds of making those kinds of policy decisions, who can meet where, what goes into the schools, or do we want somebody that is opposed to God and sometimes very anti-Christian making those choices? We're exiles, but we have, especially in our country, more ability to affect what that exile is like than other people do in other countries, and that's a blessing, right? So we ought to take advantage of that.
Yes, yeah.
Well, Eric, the last question I'd love to just ask you is, man, how, as a man who's working in the political sphere, how could we be praying for you, praying for I do see it as a vocation. I preached not long ago. We had kind of a Reformation Sunday where talked about Luther's view of vocation, and we really subscribe to that idea that what you're doing is ministry. What you're doing is vocation, and it's part of how God is ordered this world, and so I'm thankful for you and the work that you're doing. How could we be praying for you, Eric?
Well, thank you so much. This has been truly encouraging. I'm so grateful for y'all and the leadership that you're providing. You're meeting a need. If we had more pastors like you all, we'd be in good shape. So thank you. Please don't stop. Thank you for your prayers. There's no more potent weapon than that. Truly. And I deeply cherish it. Pray for all of our elected leaders. They need it, and it makes a difference. Just let me know how I can be useful to you. People have so much potential to make a difference, and it doesn't have to mean overturning your vocation or your life. But I can tell you, very few citizens are engaged. And what politicians really want is to be thought well of by the people who vote them into those jobs. And it only takes one or two people who really pay attention and get a cell phone number and nag to move people to where they need to be. And I would love to help find some of those naggers around you and get them connected so that they can be a difference.
Yeah. Thanks, Eric. If there's ways that we can pray for, encourage the work that you're doing, I'm convinced that we need more Christians who are engaged in the political sphere. I think for too long, the church, my fellow pastors, we've neglected seeing this as an aspect of discipleship and just helping people. Not that we have to have the answers to every jagged line issue, but we've just neglected helping people think as disciples of Christ in this realm of life. And it's increasingly, it feels like it's a growing sphere, because I think sometimes the nature of politics is it affects everything, right? It's going to affect family and schooling and it affects everything. It affects so if we're not discipling people how to think through that, then I feel like we're doing them a disservice. And so we're just praying for you, man, praying for you in the work that the Lord has called you to. Thankful. I'd encourage Redeemer folks, listen to the Bully Pulpit. It really is helpful hearing these guys who are mature believers talk through various things. You all seem like you like each other most of the time too, which is cool. But so that's always fun too. So yeah, thanks a lot, Eric. Really appreciate your time today. It blesses and serves our church. So thank you.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks, Eric.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys. Until next time.